capitalism is under attack. It's under attack by the left, and it's under attack by pseudo-conservatives. The market system. Now, ladies and gentlemen, look around you. As bad as it is, it's better than any other place on the face of the earth. It's better than China and Russia. It's better than France and Britain. Why? Because we're still more capitalistic than most other nations. Now, the system's unraveling. There's no question about it. It's under attack. It's under attack by the Marxist left, and they write books about it. It's under attack.
Well, speaking of the Marxist left writing books attacking capitalism, we are now joined by Professor Richard Wolff. How are you doing?
Very well. I'm very happy and proud that someone like that has recognized that we're out there doing our job.
Exactly. By the way, this is just kind of funny, but a few days ago, somebody who works with you sent me a PDF of your book, and I think this is innocent, the algorithm's just being weird, but it did make me laugh. The Gmail, I didn't see it at first because it was my spam folder, because Gmail has had this little thing on top that said, "This message seems dangerous." So, which, seemed good for...
I'm innocent. I had nothing to do with that, but it's a lovely logo, and I appreciate it, especially that it's in red.
Yes, Mark is dangerous, that book. Yeah, well, let's get right into talking about the book, Understanding Capitalism. So this is a pretty comprehensive book in terms of a lot of the points I've heard you make over the years about, how to think about capitalism and what's wrong with it and what an alternative to, could be and what we could do about it. What were you trying to do differently in this book, as compared to other things that you've written?
Well, there were two things. The first one you've already touched on. You're way ahead of me. Namely, we wanted to have a comprehensive place. Almost, if you like, I don't want to overdo this, but almost like a manual that an activist, an interested person, somebody who's just going to want to have a conversation with your bowling partner or your office mate about something. Here is a collection brought together, comprehensive, about a large body of literature, mainly the stuff I've been teaching all my life, all brought together so that you can kind of flip through and see, oh, this is what these sorts of people say. And, I'm not naive. I understand. I'm not going to persuade everybody. But if there's an honest looking for what Marxist type people have to say about something, you're going to find it in this book. You're going to find it condensed and presented in the best prose I know in terms of how to reach an audience. You don't have to be technically adept at the PhD course and none of that. This is designed to convey understanding and to work with the reader to make you aware. Even if you like capitalism, I think this is a kind of book you're going to want to read, because if you don't have a good answer for a lot of what's in here, then you're going to have to rethink about why you're committed to capitalism. And that's a healthy thing for anybody on any side of the issue to do, as you, with your focus on argument, you know all too well. So that was the first first thing. The second one was, look, I'm a little bit unusual. Lord knows why. I'm married to a psychotherapist, and we've been working for many, many years trying to figure me out along the way. What I mean is this. I went to all the fanciest schools in the United States, even though my parents had no money. I come from refugees from Europe who came with nothing. I went to all the fanciest schools. They tried to make me a great champion and cheerleader for capitalism, which is mostly what formal economics is anyway, all the way back to Smith and Ricardo.
Yeah, I've heard you point out in the past that it's a kind of funny thing about universities. They'll have one history department, one literature department, and then essentially two economics departments. One of them is called economics and the other one is called business, because one of them is giving you the cheerleading for capitalism, and the other is giving you practical information about it.
Exactly. But the thing about me that may make this book different, I hope so, is that I've always been an activist. That is, all the way back to my college days, I had a gut level sense, my God, we can do better than capitalism. Just the way a person who was a serf in medieval Europe or a slave in any of the slave societies woke up many mornings and said, it's got to be better than this, what we could achieve as a human community. So, I mean, just to give you an idea, I helped organize the Green Party of New Haven, Connecticut. I was its first candidate for the mayor of the city of New Haven, 1985. I got 10% of the vote. 2 years later, 1987, I ran for what was called or is called the Board of Aldermen in the city, sort of the city council in other parts of the country. I got 47% of the vote. I learned in those two races, when I was politically out front, and the local newspaper, the New Haven Register, used to refer to me as the Red Green, because that was cute and they could make fun of it. But you know what I learned? I learned that if you go door to door and you talk with average people, New Haven is a complicated city of many different races, classes, ethnicities, and so on. If you go door to door and you sit down at the kitchen table, you talk a half an hour or an hour, you're going to make a lot of friends. When the second time when I ran for city council in my ward, my district where I lived in New Haven, I got 47% of the vote as a Green again. In other words, there was nothing about my leftism, which I didn't hide, my anti-capitalism, which I didn't hide, that made it impossible for me to talk with people. Not at all. Quite the opposite. So I got the idea, look, if you work on it, you can shape, you can fashion the critique of capitalism in a way that makes a lot of sense to everyday people who are not going to read a lot of books, but who want to think about this, who have been, who want a conversation like this, and will respond very, very sympathetically. This book is a merger, a kind of coming together of what I learned as a teacher and a student on the one hand, but also what I learned and want to do for activists on the other, at least those who understand that whatever the issue is, that rocks your boat, that drives you, whether it's climate change or racism or anti-sexism or you name it, sooner or later you're going to have to confront that those social problems are linked one to the other through something called the economic system. It's not that the economic is more important than the others. It isn't. I don't think that for a minute. But it is the link. It's part of the problem. And only in the United States, more than anywhere in the world that I know of, is the attempt made consciously and unconsciously to keep the story of capitalism out of the conversation, to act as if that's not in question. Even your opening clip, look at the way this man uses the ideology of this country. We all know X. That's a classic debating trick. We don't all know X. We never did. There's no universal agreement. You can't ride on that. That's just a hustle. That's the same kind of game as selling me a quarter interest in the Brooklyn Bridge.
Well, you said that the economic isn't more important, and I'm thinking about that because, of course, I understand that morally lots of other things are just as important, but I wonder if you might agree that that there's a sense in which it is, which is just that if you're sort of looking for one lever that you can pull that's going to help you with a lot of these other things, that that would be it, right? So for example, you mentioned sexism, and so certainly, if in a society where everybody's material needs were met, there would be fewer people who would be staying in unequal or even abusive relationships, because they can't afford to move out on their own, and you could tell similar stories about many other things. So, there might at least be a sort of strategic sense in which this has a certain kind of primacy, that like this is something that can help you to achieve justice in a lot of different domains at once.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. The reason I stress that it's not more important than other things is Marxism, which is the tradition that I have learned a great deal from. It's not the only tradition I've learned. I have to say this. There's the sort of thing in an American context, I have to say this. It's not the only tradition I've learned from. If you know anything about the Marxist literature, you know that he studied Smith and Ricardo very closely. He wrote one of the greatest detailed analyses of Smith and Ricardo that exists in any language. So obviously, to say that you study Marx is not exclusive of other traditions, because Marx himself was deeply respectful of the traditions other than his own from which he learned. And I have that too. I'm reminded in thinking about your point of what my mother used to say. She used to say at the dinner table, money will not make you happy, but the absence of money will do a lot to make you unhappy.
Right.
In other words, she wanted us to understand not to overvalue it, but not, on the other hand, to undervalue what we do. And you're right. And it is a way to talk to people, because many differences amongst us, but too much month at the end of the money, that's a very common experience for an awful lot of people in modern capitalism. And it has always been one way that socialists or anarchists or all kinds of social critics have been able to begin a conversation on a common concern or a common feeling. I put it this way. I emphasize economics. I do. I emphasize all of that. And I say I do it because around me there is a concerted effort, part conscious, part unconscious, to ban it, to make it a taboo, to make it something we're not allowed to question. I have that moment in my mind. I would guess you saw it. It was a moment a few years ago. It went viral. It was Nancy Pelosi speaking in some college, and a young man, a student, got up, raised his hand, and basically asked a very bland question: what do you think about socialism? Or something like that.
I remember this.
Yeah, probably influenced by Bernie or something like that. And she looked, because the camera went right to her face, she looked puzzled. She looked, which I'm sure is true, that she very rarely or maybe never had heard this question before, which would tell you a lot. And she had no ready answer, no quick comeback, no funny bit that she could say, nothing. She looked befuddled, and for many seconds, which, in TV time is an era. And then she finally looked confusedly at the young man, who was perfectly pleasant. There was no tension in the room. She looked at him, she said, and this is almost a quote, "We are all capitalists now." And I remember thinking to myself, bingo, this is a story, which I'm doing, that I'm going to repeat, because it captures, we have two parties that don't question capitalism. Two parties, indeed, that present themselves each as the better guardian, the better promoter, the better friend that capitalism has. Even if it's not real, in most other countries, there are political parties who love capitalism, and there are political parties who don't. And they argue and they debate and they win elections and lose elections. we are a country that has two unique qualities. It says we believe in freedom of choice, but it seems to mean by that we want 27 varieties of toothpaste in the drugstore. We want 20 different names of automobiles. But when it comes to political parties, 2 is quite enough. Thank you. What? What happened to the freedom of choice? And particularly when you see in other countries that this is a reality and has been for many, many, many decades in all kinds of countries around the world.
Yeah.
And it's bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, I always think, that about the way we talk about freedom of choice in the 2020 primaries, when there was all this time spent debating Medicare for all, which is kind of hard to remember now because that's been the last few years. It's sort of been off the table completely as an issue, but there's all this fun debating it in 2020. And a point that people, your Buttigieg's, your Kamala Harris is probably, made at the time is they said, oh, well, look, it's one thing to provide, public health insurance to somebody who needs it. Maybe we can have some sort of, boosted up Medicaid or something. But, it's important that people have the freedom of choice about health insurance. I always thought this is such a strange, impoverished notion of free choice that, that like this idea that that's what people really care about, right? Is whether they have like Aetna or Blue Cross Blue Shield, as the financial institution in between them and their medical provider.
By the way, when you get one of them, have you ever read the 48 pages of dense print written in lawyerese? I mean, you think there are a lot of people who really compare the different plans down to, I mean, this is crazy.
I think actually reading all 48 pages of multiple plans would be prima facie evidence of medicals. Like I cannot imagine somebody voluntarily doing that. But and whereas like the kinds of things that come with having a system of private health insurance are people stay in jobs they hate because they don't want to leave because they're afraid of what'll happen if they lose their health insurance. People sometimes stay in marriages they hate because they're afraid to leave, etc. Right? And all of those things seem like, that's real freedom of choice, right? Whether you keep your job, whether you move out, like those are life decisions that I can imagine a human being actually caring about their freedom to navigate, whereas, yes, which 48 pages of legalese, you have signed onto without, having more than a vague idea of what's in it, like that's the kind of freedom of choice that, that you're supposed to care the most about. But when you're thinking about, freedom and capitalism, in this book, one of the first things you do is chapter 2 of the book is called Defining Capitalism, what it is not, right? So, since we have used this term capitalism many times already in this conversation, because of course the title of your book is Understanding Capitalism, what's the sort of, working definition that, that you would use, and how is it different from what a lot of people might think that it means?
Well, I'm so glad, Ben, really, that you asked that, because I've been doing some interviews because the book is new and all of that, and so few people pick up on that, and it's at the beginning for a reason, because it's crucial. It's like having to say to people, it's a little embarrassing, I'm talking about something everybody kind of knows, but the minute you look a little more closely, it begins to get much more complicated. Turns out different people mean very different things. It's a little bit like, if you're entering into a romantic relationship, one of the things you're going to want to get clear on pretty soon is, for example, what does the word love mean? When it comes out of your mouth, when it comes out of his or her or their mouth, et cetera, we better get that sorted out. Otherwise, we're going to make drastically mistaken judgments. It's exactly the same with capitalism. Things are thrown around that are bizarre. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. One of them, maybe the most important, is that capitalism is a system of markets, or it's the market system. For many, many years, the New York Times, among other publications, would synonymously move back and forth from capitalism to the market system, or maybe the free market system, whatever that is. Do you mean free that the government plays no role? Well, I would, as a matter of economics that I had taught all my life, there is no example in human history of a market that wasn't regulated one way or another by public agencies of various kinds, private groups of various kinds. A free market is an idea, maybe interesting and useful in certain purposes, but it doesn't describe an economic system that has ever existed, and therefore the burden is on those who think they want it or already have it to show us what in the world that might mean. Even more important, it's not correct. I mean, it's just silly. If you go to the American South, in most of the major cities of the American South, there will be a historical monument, a little plaque somewhere, and it'll say slave market. And you can visit, there'll be a little information about where the slaves came from that were bought and sold in this market, whether it be in Charleston or it be in Atlanta or anywhere else. Okay, so markets are not peculiar. That was slavery. That wasn't capitalism. So you have markets in capitalism. I can give you 1,000 examples of feudal Europe, serfs and lords, the whole feudal system, which had markets. I mean, the idea that capitalism is the system of markets. Very true. Capitalism loves markets. But so did slavery, so did feudalism, so did all kinds of ancient village communities. And then the one that really upsets Americans is, I explained it at that, from the beginning of the Soviet Union in 1917, they had lots of markets. China today is a market system. What are you talking about? How do you think, how you get a hamburger or the equivalent in Beijing? You take your money, you go to a place that makes those things, you give them the money, they give you the hamburger. That's kind of like it works here. What are you talking? So people have this odd idea. And so those chapters try to go through and say, look, there is something unique about capitalism. And it's important to be clear what that is. It isn't markets, free or otherwise. Here's what it is. It's the relationship between people as they go about producing and distributing goods and services, what you might call the production relationship. How do I interact with you when we go to the same store or factory or office to do our work? It turns out that capitalism organizes it so that there are a few people at the top, the employer, and a sizable large group at the other end of the spectrum, the employee, and a few agents of the employer in between to kind of manage everything. But we're basically divided between employers, a very small group, US Census, maximum 3% of our people are employers, and the other 97%, you, me, we are employees, okay? Now that you don't find anywhere. The employer buys my time. 5 days a week, 8 to 5, I give my brains, my muscle over to the employer. He tells me, sit there, not over there, work this way, with that machine in this manner. And when you're done, put it over there, and then get the hell out of here and go home, have a pizza, a beer, come back tomorrow, and I'll have another bunch of work for you to do. That's a very interesting relationship. It is very different from the lord and the serf. It's very different from the master and the slave. That's how we distinguish slavery and feudalism from capitalism. The Iroquois Indians in the Mohawk Valley in New England, they organized their village economy in yet another way, a communal, collective way. That's where the phrase "takes a village to raise a child," it's where it comes from. It's a different way of doing everything, but including child rearing. We don't do that way. That's very important because it gives us a way to talk about capitalism, having defined it, what it is, what it isn't, and now we can have a productive conversation. Otherwise, the conversation goes like this. You're saying something about capitalism, but you mean something altogether different than what I mean. And so we talk past each other. So the first thing this book does is say, let's stop. Here's what it is. Here's what it isn't. And by the way, I mean this. I don't require anyone to agree with me.
Sure.
Everyone will be better off knowing what some of these key differences are. Take your own position. You can call it, you're free. No one's holding you back. You're free to make whatever definition you want. What you can't do, legitimately anyway, is to act as though you have a definition. You don't have to define it. You don't have to clarify how it's different from others. And you don't have to defend why you chose that one out of the half dozen that are available. That, I think, is intellectually dishonest. So one of the reasons you see that at the beginning of my book is I want to put my proverbial cards on the table. Here's what I think it is. Here's what I think it isn't. This is my reasoning. Now you're free to go with me, not with me, part of the way, all the way. That's the reader's prerogative.
Yeah. So you're thinking about capitalism in terms of what Marx would call the relations of production. Do you have lords and serfs? Do you have slaves and slave owners? Do you have business owners and employees? And once you've before we get into your ideas about what could replace capitalism, in chapter 3 of the book, you go through a series of basic objections to capitalism. You say, for example, that it's undemocratic, that it's unequal, and that it's unstable. And I suspect that most people likely to watch this, are broadly on board with all of that. But at the same time, I think something that we're certainly interested in trying to do on the show, and I think you're interested in trying to do in the in the book, is to arm people who might be sympathetic to that kind of critique with like a way of making the case to people they interact with, who aren't, right? So like how do you go about making that argument?
Yeah, here's the way I do it. I'm going to pick. I'll pick any of them if you
Sure.
want, but I would start with the anti or the undemocratic.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the way I do it. I say to them, look, I'm going to accept, for the sake of argument, that having people vote, every so often, for the mayor of the town, for the governor of the state, for the president, all of that, that's what we mean by democracy. I say to people, I would argue against that if I could, but I'm not going to do that
Sure.
now. I'm going to give you that because it is significant that you can vote. I'm deeply respectful of the right to vote. Human beings fought for centuries to get that. Universal suffrage, for me, very important achievement of the mass of people, should never be given up. I got that. There we are in agreement. I said, but now, if you like that, if you believe in democracy, if when you read the story that once upon a time we all had kings and queens and emperors and czars and all of that, people who literally sat at the top of society could deprive people of property, of their lives, of their families, and all of that, and that we got rid of those kings, either by the guillotine or a less ugly means, et cetera, and you're not pining for them. You don't want that back. You don't see that as a loss you want to reverse. Okay, then we're on the same page. That means you believe that the people affected by a decision should have some way to shape that decision, that they have the right to participate in making the decisions that affect their lives. You know, and when I was a young person, the most vibrant organization on my campus was SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and they hammered at that point so that it became the common language of people, including those who hated SDS. If you're affected by a decision, you have the right to participate in making it, and a vote does that, gives you some participation in who the mayor is and what he's going to do, or who the governor is and what she's going to do, and so on. We're all clear. We have that in our mind. Now I come and I hit them with the point. I said, when you go to work, you cross the threshold. You leave the public street and you cross the threshold into the office, into the factory, into the store, the enterprise, if you like. And suddenly, democracy is out the window. It's gone. You don't vote for who the CEO is. You barely know the CEO's name, but the CEO can fire you. The CEO can talk about having an impact on your life. Your job is gone. Your income is gone. Your family is suddenly thrown into all the tension and stress that implies. You have no power over that person at all. He's elected or she's elected, but not by you. He or she, as CEO, makes lots of decisions that affect your life, including whether you keep the job or not, whether to hire you, fire you, make unbearable noise, make you work longer hours, change your pay, change your work schedule. 100 ways you are impacted, and you have no say at all. Nothing. You are basically told by the supervisor, the foreman, or whoever you have over you, you got two choices. You want your job, you do this. You don't do this, you don't have a job. Your choice, freedom of choice, you can leave. But of course, if you leave, you know what's going to happen? You're going to look for another job. And you know what you're going to find at that other job? Pretty much the same conditions that you had at this job, as far as what I've just said. So there is no democracy in the workplace. In the capitalist workplace, we haven't organized it. We could, but we didn't. And from day one, say here in the United States, from the days of the 1774 and our revolution, or however you want to do it, we established voting. We established a certain political democracy, but we've never dreamed of sticking it inside the workplace. And then I look at whoever I'm talking to, and I say, come on, Jack or Mary, you're an adult. You spend the best hours of your life in the workplace. 5 out of 7 days, you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you get all ready, you go to your job. That's where you spend your 8 hours that you've been building up to. And then you go home to recoup so you can do it again. So if democracy is a principle you believe in, then you've got a real problem, because capitalism deprives you of that democracy in the workplace. And then if I have their ear, I tell them it's even worse. Because if 5 out of 7 days in every job, the employee has a tactile experience of no democracy, are you going to stimulate that man, that woman, that person to be eager and have an appetite for democracy back in the residential neighborhood where they live? No. You are creating a habit to not do that. You're creating the habit of accepting that the CEO at the job is replicated by the CEO in City Hall or the CEO at the legislative office. You may know who they are. You may see them in the newspaper more often because they're bigger figures, but you're alienated from them. In other words, you weaken the political democracy by foreclosing on having an economic democracy go with it. You know, I got to tell you, Ben, and it's not because I'm particularly persuasive. That is a powerful argument. You give me a half an hour to an hour with reasonable people who may not agree with me on a good number of things, but on that one, they may not have agreed with me at the beginning, but they're going to think a lot more about this than they did before. And that's why I use it. I learned this from other people. I saw what that argument was able to do. It's a very, very powerful argument. And not just in the university, in the factory, on the shop floor, at the bar, wherever you might be, when these issues come up as they do, and as they do now more than I ever have in my lifetime. I got to tell you, since I got, white hair, I'm older than you. People like me, and me included, have tried for a long time to figure out how to make progress with our ideas, how to get more people to agree, which is our job. I always thought of that as part of my job. And I got to tell you, the last 10 years have been unlike anything that went before. I was very active as a college student in the 1960s. The war in Vietnam really changed me around in many ways. But I've never seen, I did not expect to live long enough to see what I see now. I understand what's scary in the environment. I do. We all do. You have to be dead not to see it. But what's not getting the attention, and maybe that's a good thing, is the fact that there is a building wave. In my more ebullient moments, I might even say a tsunami of people on the left in this country, even if they don't think of themselves that way, who are realizing that this system is in trouble. This system is not what we expected. Even in the MAGA movement, the very choice, make it great again, is a recognition, however dim, that it's not there anymore. And yeah, they have their story to tell about that. It's not our story, but we do have the same trajectory in our heads. And I think you're going to see in this country, based on my lifetime here. I was born, by the way, in Youngstown, Ohio. I come from the middle of the country. My parents were immigrants from Europe. So it's different. But on the other hand, my father was pushing a wheelbarrow in Youngstown, Ohio, when I was born. Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. It was where he worked. That's the job he could get as a refugee. It was an unskilled labor's job. But I've never seen this country as open as now to the kinds of things I'm saying. And that, too, was a major stimulus to write such a book.
Yeah, I think this is something you and I have talked about before. I think it might have been before or after I was on air when I was on your show a few years ago in New York. But my mother grew up in Youngstown, so I grew up. Yeah. Back in the era when the steel mills were belching out so much all the time that people. My grandmother worked as a nurse in public hospital in Youngstown. And, I remember her saying once that they were shocked when they would see somebody with pink lungs, because it was so, it was just being there was smoking packs a day. And, by the time, I was growing up, of course, that was in the past, but I grew up visiting Youngstown, and not that many years ago, me and my ex-wife used to stop through Youngstown pretty regularly to visit a relative who was still there. And I have to say, in terms of your point about MAGA, this is, Youngstown as it is now is just, and really since I've been visiting there, I mean, I can remember my grandfather when I was visiting Youngstown, seeing him drive at night and every, red lights were yield signs, right? The crime rate is such that, you didn't want to linger, at red lights at night. And And like, it's just such a dramatic, like that, everything about that city now, I mean, is such a dramatic illustration of that thing about what I, optimistically would still like to call late capitalism, that that leads people to nod along to sentences like "Make America Great Again," right? Yeah. As in, like, right now, things are not, things are not what they should be, right? Because it's so the sort of face of deindustrialization in a place like Youngstown, even now, right? So long after most of the steel mills closed, is just such a grim illustration of what this society, what this way of organizing a society can do, and of course it goes to your point just now about the undemocratic heading of the third chapter of your book, and of course also the second one, the unequal part, because those decisions, right, to take in many cases profitable steel mills and relocate them somewhere else where you can make even higher profits, are things that impact vast numbers of people's lives, and dramatically, like, can destroy vast numbers of people's lives. But of course, most of the people whose lives are impacted by something like that, have no input on it whatsoever.
That's right. Look, I use the example because, being an economist, I study these numbers, I'm familiar. But you take Detroit. In the 1970s, Detroit was the place that presidents of the United States took foreign visitors. Some president of some other country visits Washington, they have their meetings and all that, but they take an airplane, they go to Detroit, and the president, whoever that president happened to be, and it was true for Republicans, Democrats, didn't matter, showing them this metropolis, 2 million people in 1970 in Detroit, making it one of the 10 biggest cities in the country. And there were the Ford and GM and Chrysler and all of the workers. And then you could even say, look, this is happy capitalism. The workers are happy. Look at their faces. And these were UAW workers, at that time the most powerful union in the United States, that under the left-wing Ruther brothers had become a very powerful union, able to deliver extraordinary wages and benefits to workers. So exceptional that even after the great migration of large numbers of African Americans from the American South went to Detroit, hoping to get jobs in the auto industry, were able to get a significant number of them, so that this president could even show black and white working together, living pretty near each other. The black workers had their homes and their cars in the driveway and the whole bit. It was a celebration of a successful capitalism. 2 million people. Today in Detroit, a third of the city is abandoned. It's just, I've been there. It's empty houses, one after another, street after a street. The population of Detroit, by its own count, 700,000 people. That means 1,300,000 of them left Detroit, gone. The family leaving behind that abandoned house that you can now see. Going where? Well, many of them went to Cleveland or to Wilmington, Delaware, where it all happened again to them. I mean, it's beyond belief. And the decisions made by a handful of super rich people, the board of directors of GM, the board of directors of Ford, deciding that the automobile business would be more profitable in Mexico, in Canada, in China. GM now sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. It depends on China more than the United States, which is changing global politics even as we speak. All of this is a consequence of how capitalism works. And if you think this has to do with democracy, well, then either you never thought about it, or your definition of democracy is one that would be straining for anyone else to go along with. And the inequality, by the way, is a footnote to all of this. You can't keep doing the last 40 years, American corporations, big ones, most of them, established business in China. Other countries too, but I'm going to use China
Sure.
as a basic example. And they went over there, and the documentation for this is infinitely large. They went over there for two reasons, which they will tell you. And if you read the financial literature, which I do, the Financial Times, the global, work on that, Blooming, all of it, they went for two reasons. Number one, they got a skilled, disciplined labor force as good as any in the world at a fraction of what they would have to pay in wages if they were here. They went from a high wage to a low wage situation. Number two, because everybody else was doing this, Japanese capitalists and European capitalists all going into China at the same time. In fact, the Europeans and the Japanese were ahead of the United States. That's why Kissinger and Nixon had to go to China to catch up. Anyway, that was the fastest growing market in the world because everybody was coming there, hiring all these people. There was a limitless amount of rural people coming into the cities of China. So it was what? It was where the wages were lowest and the market was growing the fastest. Well, I've taught in business schools. That's what we teach young entrepreneurs. You want to be wealthy? You want to succeed? Go to where the wages are low and the market is growing. China is the place. They went. And the Chinese said to them, no surprise, you can come here. We welcome you. Come here and hire our people. Come here and sell into our market. But you got to give us something.
Right.
You got to give us access to your technology because you're ahead of us in a lot of areas, which we were then, not so much now, but then a lot. And the last thing that the Chinese said, we can produce it. We can produce as good as you can, and we'll soon be doing it better, and we can do a lot cheaper. But we don't have any way to distribute in the United States. So we want you to work with us to give us access to the market in the United States through distributors. Okay, I can then show you a line in which Amazon, Walmart, Target, they are all creatures of China. I mean, they're separate private enterprises. They were the agent that bought the high quality, low price Chinese commodity into every American city and town. But nobody held a gun to anybody's head. This was a deal that was made. It advantaged the United States. They made a profit they had never imagined before. The last 30 years, the people who own shares, the 10% who own 80% of our shares, made out like bandits because they got their fingers on some of this profit from China. They loved it. They promoted it. They gave it a name, neoliberal globalization. Doesn't matter. They did really well with it. They loved it. But for the mass of Americans, their jobs disappeared. They were, they became greeters at Walmart, handling the Chinese commodities that they could no longer produce. There were winners and losers, in short. And the gap between them is called inequality, economically speaking. And that's why it's gotten worse for the last 30 to 40 years. There's no mystery here. There's no, let me tell you a story because, and I may have told you the story before. If I do, stop me. When I was a graduate student, like getting my PhD in economics at Yale University, it was dominated by males. There were very few women who took economics courses, even fewer who majored in them, and I mean, almost none who went to graduate school. So if there was a young lady in the class near us, we, the boys, the men, noticed it.
Sure.
You noticed that. So I had in my class, in some of my classes, a young lady who appeared there who was a student just like me. Her name, Janet Yellen. See, so you know her name in the way you don't know mine. because she had quite a history afterwards, as she does now. Well, every year or so, she gives a speech, and I kind of follow her because I knew her back then. We had the same teachers, the same books, the same classes, took the same exams. I really know about economics, pretty much what she does because we were learning it together.
Mm-hmm.
She gives a speech where she says, correctly, that the inequality is getting worse and worse, and that's a real problem. Because if some people are not enjoying the prosperity of our great economy while other people are, that's going to lead to trouble. You don't need to be a genius to figure this out. She figured it out. She says it. And from everything I can tell, she means it. She's sincere about it. She recognizes it as a problem. But she has been presiding over the most powerful economic institutions in our country. The Secretary of the Treasury, the head of the Federal Reserve, you name it. And it keeps getting worse year after year. The people at the top are either unwilling or unable to do anything about a capitalism that is making more and more inequality, which again, I think most people would agree, fuels the very social tensions and hostilities, the MAGA movement, the reaction to the MAGA movement, the violence that we see, even the events, if we had time, like the war in Ukraine or the activity in Gaza. Capitalism is now a global system. And in some sense, it is a player in those areas where really horrible things are happening. The people of Ukraine, whatever you think about the war, are being decimated. Their country is being literally pulverized. And the same thing we all know in Gaza, and who knows now with the latest story, and perhaps in Lebanon as well. This is a system that is doing really bad things around the world, and there ought to be a debate about capitalism per se, rather than dancing around the edges and never facing that particular part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I actually want to linger on that last point about capitalism and war, because this is, I think about the kinds of divisions you even see on the left about something like the war in Ukraine, and my kind of simple-minded reaction is that is that the sort of basic duty of the left is to oppose war and promote peace, and I always think of, I'm sure there's that song, "You Ain't Done Nothing If You Ain't Been Called a Red." And one of the lyrics, right? The lyrics about marching and organizing, and and they rattle off the causes, and then they end with an "and always against war," right? Because it's sort of taken so much for granted, right? That this is a kind of core commitment of the left, which I have to say makes sense to me, because if nothing else, I mean, look, who dies in wars, right? I mean, people, politicians, people who own, companies that manufacture weapons, these people don't die in wars, right? They're not mutilated, it's the working class.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why, that famous parallel between the leader of the American Socialist Party, Eugene Victor Debs, and the leader of the Russian equivalent, Vladimir Lenin. They both went to jail. They both became culprits in their society because they dared to stand up, both of them, and say to their respective working classes, this is not a war you should participate in. Wars are when working class of one country is shooting the working class of another. We're not the winners. We are always the losers. And therefore, the war can't happen if we don't fight. We should not fight. They put Debs in jail. He ran for president from jail back at the beginning of the 20th century. Lenin was incarcerated, but then could escape, went and lived in Switzerland for a while before he went back. But it's absolutely. And let me be very personal in case it's relevant. When I said to you at the beginning of our discussion that my parents were refugees. My mother was born and raised in Berlin, Germany, and my father was born and raised in Metz, M-E-T-Z, which is a city on the border of France and Germany, technically part of France. So I have a French father and a German mother. Why were they refugees? They were running from Hitler. They were running from the Second World War. That's why they came. All right. About 2/3 of my family were killed in the concentration camps.
Yeah.
You know, I lost my aunt in Auschwitz. My grandparents were killed in Mauthausen. I mean, I can go through it. You know, it's a family lore. Well, other people say, well, wasn't it funny when Uncle Harry did this? In my family, it was, where did this one die? Where did that one? And not die natural death, die a premature death. All right. So, and yet when I see the horrors of Nazism and all of that, even then I understood, and in later years I wrote my master's thesis about it. What were the economic forces that could turn a people like the German people, who had produced Kant and Hegel and Beethoven and Brahms and Goethe? I mean, I was raised on German literature. My parents, even though they had suffered terribly, always valued German literature and culture as a great human achievement, which I think it is, and all that. But so how did a country of that quality then do these unspeakably horrible things? That's an important question to ask, because now we see that the victims and their descendants in Israel, instead of being victims of a Holocaust, are becoming the perpetrators of a Holocaust. I mean, and that would force everybody else to say, if it could happen to the Germans with their cultural history, and if it could happen to the Israelis with their particular history, well, it can happen to everybody. We better figure that out, because otherwise we're going to be surprised when it happens to us. We're not that different from the Germans or the Israelis in terms of what we're capable of, or at least I'd have to hear an argument. I haven't heard it. I'm
there's no magical cultural essence that, you know, makes some people capable of these things and other people not. You know,
that's right.
You have to look at exactly. Yeah. Well, you know, if you've got just a few more minutes with us, I wanted to talk about one more chapter of your book, because of course, before this show existed, there was the debunk segment that I would do every week on the Michael Brooks Show, and in somewhat the same spirit.
I believe that's how we first.
No, that is how we met. Yeah, that's right. And in somewhat the same spirit as that, you know, chapter 4 of the book is called The Myths of Capitalism. You sort of go through and, you know, and try to, you know, take these apart, you know, one at a time. And of course, there are quite a few myths. So, you know, we probably don't have time to go over all of them, but I wanted to go over a few with you. So one of them, for example, is monopoly, not capitalism, is the problem, which, of course, is something that's, you know, an incredibly common view in, you know, certainly in American politics, that, you know, we do, as you say, there's, you know, a very limited tradition of, you know, of socialism. You have your heroes like Eugene Debs, you know, but as far as, you know, people actually, you know, rising to the heights of, you know, taking power, you know, there's very little. But of course, we, you know, have a long tradition of trust busting, you know, politics, and that's, you know, that's still a live issue. And even on the right, you get people who will say, well, you know, I don't have a problem with capitalism, but, you know, like corporatism, maybe, you know, they'll say, you know, that I'll sort of acknowledge as a problem, right? So I think implicit in a lot of these ideas is well, capitalism would be one thing if you just kind of had a properly functioning market, including a capitalist labor market. But, the real problem, the real reason you see all of this misery and inequality and instability around us is about monopolies, right? So how do you respond to that?
Well, I respond by saying, look, there is a whole collection of ways in which capitalism, and let's remember, it's been around now 3 or 4 centuries. People fight about dating it, but it starts in Britain and spreads to Europe and then to North America and Japan and eventually the whole world. In terms of capitalism as understood as the employer-employee way of organizing business. There have been loads of attacks on it all along the way, and there have been loads of defenses mounted against those attacks. And nothing is more common among the defenses than the attempt to say, well, yes, there is a problem you critics have rightly pointed to, but it's not capitalism. It is some feature of capitalism which we can fix. And then we will get the good part of capitalism. We won't sacrifice that. We're not going to go where you're pointing, get rid of capitalism. We're going to fix this flaw, this imperfection. Literally, it's called that in formal economics. You have perfect competition and imperfect competition, and monopoly is a kind of imperfect competition, okay? This is a very old game. You'll see it played a lot by people who aren't aware that they're playing it, either because they don't know the literature or they haven't thought about it very long. So, for example, nowadays you will hear crony capitalism. Ooh, that's a bad kind. So what you need to do is get rid of the crony capitalism, and then you'll have capitalism.
Gene Epstein and clean capitalism, right? That's
clean capital, compassionate capitalism. A few years ago, people's capitalism. That's when folks got terribly excited that workers were owning shares of stock. Ooh, that's a people's capitalism. That's a good one. Crony capitalism, very bad. Look, the whole history of the third world, the global south, they made the distinction. There is colonial capitalism, and then there is independent capitalism. And colonialism was bad, but no. After the revolution, when we're independent, we'll make another kind of capitalism, and it'll be a lot better. That argument is now very dead, but it was in the 1960s and 70s a very powerful argument. There are people who think in the African American community that the solution to its problems are to develop black capitalism. That for them, the problem of capitalism is that it was dominated by whites, which it clearly was. And if they could undo that somehow, fix that somehow, they could have a black capitalism that would be as successful for them as white capitalism was for the whites, which interestingly denies the importance of African Americans to the success of white capitalism. The United States, for example, had nothing to sell to the rest of the world at the beginning. It had furs, it had junk from North America, which nobody in the world wanted very much. They had to come up with something that was valuable. And finally they did. Cotton. Why? Right. Because Britain was the engine of capitalism around the world. And how did that engine work? How did it succeed? By producing cotton textiles, by giving the world a way to clothe the human being that didn't depend on an animal like a sheep for the wool, that could be grown anywhere, well, not anywhere, but in large parts of the world. So the United States, early in its history, came face to face with the reality. You got one thing that the world will pay you limitless amounts of money for a limited quantity, limitless. And that's cotton. And you have moist, hot climate in parts of your country where you can grow it. And you have a wonderful ocean, you can ship it. You have everything except one thing. No labor. They even tried to get the indigenous people before they killed them to work.
Right.
That didn't work. The so-called Indians wouldn't have it. So we solved the problem by black slaves who produced this very profitable commodity, which gave the United States its beginnings as an accumulating capitalist society. White wealth is dependent on black, not out of a moral argument, but out of the hard economic reality of our society. So what you see here is capitalism is great. It's just when there's a monopoly, when there's only one or two sellers and they're super big, they take advantage. See, all of that is true. When there are only a few, they take advantage. But the critique of Marx and of most of those on the left like me is not a critique of monopoly. I'll be glad to do such a critique, but you don't need us Marxists for that. People who like capitalism have been busy doing that for that's why we have, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the Clayton Act early in the 20th century. That became popular wisdom. It still is. We have a big antitrust department. But the problem is you can get rid of monopoly. You still have capitalism. You still have the employer-employee relationship. And here's the irony. Monopoly usually provokes, it's an incentive for itself to be broken by some new, right? General Motors and Ford had a monopoly, but then Tesla, then Toyota, then Nissan, then it's gone. The very wild profits monopolists make bring in the marauders who want a piece of that, which undoes the monopoly. They go back and forth. Very hard to sustain a monopoly. And the only way you can do it for long periods of time is if you have a stranglehold on the government and can make the government enforce your monopoly. We, in this country, we spend more on our health care than any country on earth, 19% of our GDP. Nobody pays anything like that. Why? Because we have a medical industrial complex, hospitals, doctors, medical insurers, and the drug producers and the device producers. They work as a team. They work very closely together, and they have us, and we pay, and they hold that monopoly. And they don't let anybody in. You can't have more than a certain number of doctors. You will not accredit more than a certain number of hospitals. You will put the drug producing through a rigmarole with the FDA. All of it carefully structured over time. It took time. And it can disappear. There's nothing, but that's how you do it. You make it, and then you bring the government in to solidify it. By the way, this is a lesson that the socialists haven't learned all that well. That you still find many socialists trying to tell people that vote for us because we'll get the government to clean up capitalism, to make it less harsh, to make it more friendly. And then they tell you, look at all the things the government does in Denmark or in Germany or in Italy. And it's true, the governments do much more of social supports in those countries. My family is French. You get sick, my family gets sick. They don't care about it. They go to the nearest doctor, they get treated. Everything is taken care of from the day you're born till the day you're dead. There is you don't even have payment. You show a card, everybody gets a card. You show a card, that card is stuck in a machine and it's recorded in the government that you went to a doctor and you had to, but you don't pay money. They have an army of people they don't hire because they don't need them. There's no haggling between the insurance company and the doctor over whether your particular ailment is covered or not. They don't do that. Yet it's socially unacceptable. We don't have anything like that in this country. We allow the government to give that monopoly freely to those people. The politicians are bought off to keep it going. That's how you have a long-term monopoly. It's like our defense industry, it's our medical industry, and you have other industries that are trying to do that too. Much of the presidential race we're watching between Trump and now Kamala Harris is being financed and supervised by the last remaining dynamic industry this country has, which is Silicon Valley high tech. And they have different agendas for what they want the government to do. Mr. Vance is a protege of Peter Thiel, who comes directly from that part of the country. I mean, it's transparent once you know to look for it. And we know what they're trying to do. They're trying to construct a secure, which is not easy, monopoly of the Apples and all the others, so that they can hold on to the extraordinary wealth they have accumulated in a relatively short time. And if they're going to go the way of the medical industry or the defense industry, they will succeed. And that will become an area nobody else touches. The way you said, Ben, we used to talk about universal health care, and now there's nothing haphazard or accidental about that. That's been pushed off the agenda by a concerted effort to push it off the agenda.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I mean, on the point, about monopolies. I mean, I like what you said. That it's like, look, there's a sort of correct critique of monopolies and case for for anti-monopoly legislation that you could make, but you don't need to bring in Marxists to make that case, right? Plenty of other people are willing to make it, and that seems right to me, because of course you've got there are undoubtedly, right, many social ills that monopoly has something to do with. But if you think about the sort of core harms of capitalist property relations, I mean, anybody who's ever worked for a small firm knows that there's no if you work at a smaller firm, that doesn't mean that you have more control over what's going on at the workplace than at a bigger firm, or that you're paid more wages, or you get more break time, or any of that stuff. In fact, if anything,
Probably
often the contrary.
Yeah.
Because they're they're working on a smaller profit margin.
But it's interesting, because when you bring that up, I'm reminded of this ideological conundrum that I learned as a professor. I used to, at the beginning of my classes, I would hand out a piece of paper or a little 3x5 card. And I often was asked, because I'm a bit of a show person, as you can tell. My mother always wanted me to be a stand-up comedian.
That's one you don't hear very often. That's careers that mothers are pushing up people.
Yes, right. Anyway, I would hand out a piece of paper, and I would say, I have some questions. I want to get to know you. You're my students. I can know more about you. I'll make my lectures more interesting for you. Okay. And so one of the questions I would always ask them is, tell me, how do you imagine you would like to be 5 years after you graduate from this university? You'll have your BA, and what would you like to be 5 years beyond? And the overwhelming majority, this is in the University of Massachusetts, where I did this mostly up in Amherst, Mass. Overwhelming majority wanted to be, I quote you now, my own boss. Right. They wanted to set up a small firm. They understood it would be small because they would be in charge, but they didn't want to be their image of horror, working in some nameless cubicle on the floor of a high rise in which 50 other cubicles were crammed in to some inadequately lit place. That was their horror, and they were going to be self-employed. And it took me a while to figure out they are protesting, those young people, without knowing it, their parents, because that's what their parents are, stuck in a cubicle or in some down and out kind of job in a factory, an office, or a store, or at least that's how it looks to them. And they don't want it. They want to be their own boss. They do not understand the statistics. And when I give it to them, that the overwhelming majority of little businesses go out of business within the first 2 years, and that therefore, I tell them, here's the odds. You got a better chance becoming wealthy buying lottery tickets than this strat. You should see their faces. It's like talking to a 5-year-old from whom you have taken the ice cream cone. Whoa! How is there this evil in the world that I don't have my vanilla cone anymore? They're holding on. They are actually critics of capitalism without knowing it, without having the language or the vocabulary to make the case clearly, but they are already worried about where this system is putting them. And Massachusetts is a very important state because everybody there, and most of the students who go to the University of Massachusetts come from Massachusetts. They're full of the Harvards and the Welsleys and the MIT. They know where the elite, the people at the top of the system, are going to school over there, down the road. That's not where they are. They are middle management if they're lucky. And they know it. They couldn't put it in those words, but they know it. And they're hoping to escape. And they want me to tell them about cryptocurrency because they looked at what happened to the price of a Bitcoin. Oh my God, that's my way out. It's like the stories I used to hear of African Americans who wanted to become boxers or athletes or young women who wanted to become great actresses. They wanted to get out of where they were, and they were looking to these avenues that might save them. But when you think like that, there's in it already social criticism. That mentality is halfway there. And I think our job, and it's getting easier by the day, is to take it that other halfway.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of Abraham Lincoln gave this speech in 1861 where he was the Civil War had already started. He's talking about, of course, the evils of the slave system that they're fighting to defeat. And in the course of it, he talks about objections that people were already making to this industrial capitalism, that's arising in the North, right? That's not so great either. And in his, Lincoln isn't a socialist. He's defending capitalism here ultimately, but he says something really interesting, which is that there's no such thing as a free man being fixed for life in the condition of a hired laborer. And his, and the vision that he's offering there, which is already a little anachronistic when he was making it, and is, obviously much more so now, is, well, okay, sure, granted, in our system, people might have to, work as hired laborers for a while earlier in life, but then they build up some money and they can go out on their own, right? Start their own shop, their own business, and of course, they, again, even in 1861, I mean, this was already kind of hearkening back to this slightly technologically outdated ideal. And, 2024, obviously that much more so because any sufficiently advanced economy, most labor is cooperative, right? So, so either it's cooperative and democratic, or it's going to be cooperative and undemocratic, right? Those are the options. I mean, just logically,
right. And by the way, the book works that point out. I mean, that the argument is we don't have to accept this arrangement. It is no disrespect to capitalism to say about it, as Marx did. It had its role to play. It was a phase of human development. It developed technology especially well and quickly. Nowadays we would add, but it fouled the environment along the way, and that's fair. That's fair. But it's a mixture of strengths and weaknesses. But like every other economic system, it was born, it evolved and changed over time, and then it died. And with capitalism, here's what we can say. It was born, we know that. It has evolved and changed, we know that. Therefore, we do know what's next. We know it about ourselves as human beings, but we know it about the system. And so the really interesting question isn't whether The interesting question is when, and the corollary to that question is, well, maybe now.
Well, I certainly can't come up with a better note for us to end on that than Professor Wolff. Where can people get this book?
Well, you have that flyer there. You could give it. The easiest thing is to go to our website. It's called democracyatwork.info/books. If you go there, you get information about the book, how to order it. It's available in paperback, in an ebook, and so forth and so on. But that's the best way. Democracyatwork.info. And from there, it'll take you to get that done. And it's inexpensive because we want people to be able to afford it.
Nice. Well, we're about a week past the 4-year anniversary of the passing of our friend Michael Brooks, and this whole time I kept thinking about how excited he was when I was talking to him about the first time you came on the show back in, I believe, late 2018. I
had a wonderful time on his show, and for about half a year before he passed, we were talking actively about a whole set. He was a very creative. He had ideas of things we could do, and before we had even gotten through one of them, he already had another one.
That was Michael. Yeah.
But they were good. He had obviously thought about them before, but they were coming back, and now he could see how we could do. So yeah, I miss him, and I miss all those projects that I wish we had gotten underway. So I worked with his sister for a while, and that was very
Alicia.
Yeah,
that's great. All right, thank you so much, Professor Wolff. Pleasure to have the show. It's been far too long.
Yes, and please, next time, let's do it again, and then no more Professor. Just call me Rick.
I will try to force myself to do that. Sounds good. Bye, Rick.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.